The parlor smelled of imported tobacco and her father's rising fury. Josephine Stewart stood near the window, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Outside, Boston's spring rain ran down the glass in crooked streams, blurring the gaslit street into watery gold. Inside, her father's voice carved through the room like a blade through leather. "You will marry Harold Grimstead," Charles Stewart said, each word weighted with the kind of authority that had built empires and crushed competitors. "This discussion is finished." "No." The word came out smaller than she'd intended, but it landed hard enough. Her father's jaw tightened. He set his glass down on the mantel with deliberate control, the crystal base clicking against marble. "What did you say?" Josephine turned from the window. Her father stood framed by the fireplace, his silver-streaked hair impeccable, his suit cut from fabric most men would never touch. He looked every inch the industrial titan the newspapers claimed he was. But tonight, to her, he looked like a stranger bartering away her life for a railroad contract. "I said no." Her voice came steadier this time. "I won't marry him." Charles Stewart's face darkened. "You ungrateful!" "He's twice my age and everyone knows what happened to his first wife." Josephine's pulse hammered in her throat, but she held her ground. "She didn't fall down those stairs by accident. The servants talk, Father. The whole city talks." "Gossip." He waved a dismissive hand. "Slander from jealous mouths. Harold Grimstead is a powerful man with connections that will secure this family's position for generations." "Then you marry him." The slap came fast, not hard enough to knock her down, but sharp enough to snap her head to the side and fill her mouth with the copper taste of blood. Her mother gasped from the doorway where she'd been hovering like a decorative ghost, too weak to intervene, too complicit to object. Josephine touched her split lip, her fingers coming away red. She looked at her father and saw something she'd been avoiding for years. He didn't see her as a daughter. He saw her as currency, a bargaining chip in expensive silk. "You will marry Harold Grimstead in 3 weeks," her father said, his voice cold and absolute. "Or you will leave this house with nothing, no inheritance, no family name, no support of any kind." "Charles, please." Her mother's voice was a thin, reedy thing, easily ignored. "Enough, Margaret." He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed locked on Josephine. "Well, what will it be?" Josephine straightened her spine. Blood dripped onto the collar of her ivory dress, a spreading stain that would never wash clean. The parlor felt smaller suddenly, suffocating, like all of Boston had compressed down to this single moment of choice. "I'll leave." Her mother made a sound like something breaking. Her father's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest trace of uncertainty. He'd expected her to fold. They always folded. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "The world outside this house is harder than you know. You've been sheltered, spoiled, given everything. You'll come crawling back within a month, and when you do, the terms will be worse. Then I suppose I won't come back." She turned and walked toward the door, her legs shaking, but her steps even. Her mother reached for her as she passed, fingers catching at her sleeve. "Josie, don't do this. You don't understand what you're throwing away. I understand perfectly." Josephine pulled free, gentle but firm. "I'm throwing away a cage." She climbed the stairs to her bedroom for the last time, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. The house she'd grown up in suddenly felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and cold and full of dead things. Her room looked exactly as it had that morning. The four-poster bed with its embroidered canopy, the wardrobe full of dresses she'd never chosen, the vanity cluttered with perfumes and powders meant to make her more palatable to men like Harold Grimstead. She looked at it all and felt nothing but relief at leaving it behind. She packed quickly. 1 trunk. Practical clothes, a few books, the small inheritance from her grandmother that her father couldn't touch. Her hands trembled as she worked, adrenaline and terror mixing into something that tasted like freedom. By dawn, she was gone. The train west left from a station she'd never seen, in a part of the city her carriage had never ventured. Josephine sat in the third-class car surrounded by immigrants and laborers, her fine trunk looking absurd among their bundled possessions. No one spoke to her. She didn't speak to them. She'd sent a telegram the night before to her Aunt Margaret in Colorado, her father's estranged sister, the family scandal, the woman who'd fled Boston 20 years ago and never looked back. The reply had come terse and unsentimental. You can come. Don't expect comfort. It was more than she'd hoped for. The journey took 6 days. 6 days of rattling tracks and cramped benches and the slow, creeping realization that she'd severed something that couldn't be repaired. At night, when the train stopped at nameless depots to take on water and coal, she'd step onto the platform and look east toward everything she'd left behind. She never felt the urge to go back. The landscape changed as they traveled. Boston's neat brick and cobblestone gave way to farmland, then prairie, then something wilder. Mountains rose in the distance like teeth, the air grew thinner. The passengers who'd started the journey with her gradually disembarked, replaced by harder-looking people in rougher clothes. By the time the train pulled into Silver Creek, Colorado, Josephine was the only woman in the car wearing a dress that cost more than some of these people made in a year. She gathered her trunk and stepped onto a platform that was little more than weathered planks and a hand-painted sign. The town sprawled before her like something built in a hurry and never finished. Wooden buildings lined a muddy main street. Horses stood hitched to rails, their breath steaming in the cool mountain air. Men in worn hats and dusty boots moved between the general store and the saloon, their eyes tracking her with open curiosity. She stood there suddenly paralyzed. The reality of what she'd done crashed over her like a wave. She was alone. Truly alone. In a place that looked nothing like home, surrounded by strangers who would offer no help if she stumbled. "You Josephine Stewart?" The voice was female, rough as gravel, and came from a woman standing near a wagon. She was maybe 50, maybe older, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face carved by weather and hardship into something both harsh and handsome. "Yes, are you—" "Margaret Hayes. We're not using Stewart out here." Her aunt looked her up and down with an expression somewhere between pity and contempt. "You look like you've never worked a day in your life." "That's not a question. Get your trunk in the wagon." Josephine blinked. You thought I'd help you load it?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Welcome to the frontier, girl. You want something done, you do it yourself." The trunk was heavy. Josephine had packed it herself back in Boston, but she'd had a footman carry it down the stairs. Now she gripped the leather handles and pulled, her back screaming in protest, her fine dress dragging in the mud. Margaret watched without offering assistance. When Josephine finally heaved the trunk into the wagon bed, sweating and breathing hard, her aunt just nodded. "It'll get easier, or you'll get stronger. Same thing out here." They rode through town in silence. Josephine cataloged everything she saw: the saloon with its swinging doors, the assayer's office, the general store advertising flour and ammunition in the same window display. Men outnumbered women 10 to 1. Everyone looked tired. Everyone looked hard. The boarding house sat at the edge of town, a 2-story structure that had been whitewashed once but now wore its paint in peeling strips. A sign out front read Hayes House in faded letters. "I run a clean establishment," Margaret said as she climbed down from the wagon. "No drinking, no fighting, no entertaining men in your room. You'll earn your keep through work, cooking, cleaning, laundry, whatever needs doing. I don't have money to pay you, but you'll have a bed and meals." "I understand. Do you?" Margaret fixed her with a look that seemed to see straight through the expensive dress to the scared girl underneath. "Your father wrote me a letter, said you were stubborn and ungrateful, said you'd thrown away a good marriage out of childish pride." Josephine's chest tightened. "That's not— I don't care what the truth is." Margaret shouldered Josephine's trunk like it weighed nothing and headed for the door. "Out here, your past doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can pull your weight. Can you?" "I don't know." It was the most honest thing she'd said in days. Margaret paused on the porch and looked back at her. "At least you're not lying to yourself. That's something." She pushed the door open. "Come on, I'll show you where you'll sleep." The room was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the mountains. After Boston's luxury, it should have felt like a punishment. Instead, it felt like the first space that had ever truly been hers. Margaret left her to unpack. Josephine opened her trunk and stared at the contents: dresses meant for parlors and dinner parties, gloves that had never touched anything rougher than a teacup, books of poetry and philosophy that suddenly seemed useless as decorative stones. She hung what she could in the tiny closet and pushed the trunk under the bed. Then she sat on the mattress and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She was in Colorado, in a town that barely qualified as civilization, with an aunt who looked at her like a burden at best. She had no money, no prospects, no plan beyond surviving until she figured out what came next. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in her 22 years, she felt like she could breathe. The work started the next morning before sunrise. Margaret pounded on her door at an hour that felt criminal, shouting something about breakfast needing to be ready by 6. Josephine stumbled downstairs in yesterday's dress to find the kitchen already hot from the cook stove, her aunt elbow-deep in biscuit dough. "You know how to cook?" Margaret asked without looking up. My family had a cook." "Of course they did." Margaret nodded toward a pile of potatoes. "Peel those. Try not to take off half the potato with the skin." Josephine had never peeled a potato in her life. She picked up the knife her aunt thrust at her and started working, slowly, clumsily, cutting herself twice in the first 10 minutes. Margaret glanced over and sighed. "You'll learn or you'll bleed to death. Either way, keep going." By the time the boarders came down for breakfast, Josephine's hands were cramping and covered in small cuts, but she'd managed a passable pile of peeled potatoes. Margaret fried them up with eggs and bacon while Josephine set the table, trying not to stare at the men who filled the dining room. They were miners mostly, or prospectors, or men working claims in the hills. They ate like they were starving, shoveling food without conversation, their focus absolute. One of them nodded at her in thanks. The rest ignored her completely. "They'll warm up once they figure out you're staying," Margaret said as they cleared plates later. "But don't expect much. Most of them came out here to get away from something. They're not interested in making friends. What did you come out here to get away from?" Margaret paused, her hands still in the dishwater. For a moment, Josephine thought she wouldn't answer. "Your grandfather," she finally said, "and a marriage that would have killed me slower than a bullet." She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron. "Your father tell you why we don't speak?" "No." "Good. That means he's got at least a little shame left." Margaret hung the dishcloth and turned to face her. "I left Boston the same way you did, running from a man who thought he owned me. Difference is, I was already married, had to leave in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on my back." Josephine stared at her. "You were married?" "To a banker, rich, respectable, and mean as a snake when no one was looking." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Your grandfather arranged it, said it was a good match. Took me 2 years to realize I'd rather die free than live in that house." "What happened to him?" "The banker." "Don't know, don't care. I came west, filed for divorce in a territory that allowed it, and never looked back." She met Josephine's eyes. "That's why your father hates me. Not because I left, but because I refused to come crawling back when things got hard." "Did things get hard?" Margaret laughed, the sound bitter and genuine at once. "Girl, you have no idea." The days blurred into a rhythm that left no room for reflection. Wake before dawn. Start the cook stove. Prepare breakfast for 12 hungry men. Clean the dishes, scrub the floors, haul water from the well. Do laundry in a tub out back, her hands going red and raw in the cold water. Prepare lunch. Prepare dinner. Collapse into bed so exhausted that sleep came before thought. Josephine's body rebelled at first. Her back ached from bending over the washtub. Her hands blistered from the lye soap and the firewood she learned to split. Her feet screamed from standing all day on the hard kitchen floor. But slowly, something changed. The blisters hardened into calluses. The muscles in her arms and shoulders adapted. She learned to lift heavy pots without straining, to gauge the cook stove's heat by feel, to scrub a floor in half the time it first took her. She also learned the town. Silver Creek existed because of the mines. Silver had been found in the hills 5 years back, and the town had sprung up almost overnight, a collection of hopeful men convinced that fortune was just one more dig away. Some struck it rich, most didn't, but they all needed somewhere to sleep and eat, and that's where people like Margaret made their living. The town had one main street and a dozen buildings that mattered. The general store, run by a tired-looking man named Carson, who sold everything from flour to dynamite. The assayer's office, where miners brought their ore to be tested and valued. The saloon, which did steady business from noon until well past midnight. The blacksmith shop, where a huge man named Tom fixed everything from horseshoes to broken axe handles. And scattered around the edges, the people who kept the town running. Laundresses and cooks. A doctor who'd lost his license back east, but still knew how to set bones. A school teacher who taught the handful of children in a one-room building that doubled as the church on Sundays. Josephine watched them all, learning the ecosystem of frontier survival. Out here, everyone had a role. Everyone contributed. The delicate, ornamental life she'd lived in Boston had no place in Silver Creek. You worked, or you starved. It was that simple. Margaret never coddled her, but she taught her how to make bread that didn't come out like a rock, how to bargain with Carson at the general store for better prices, how to read the weather in the mountains so you didn't get caught in a storm, how to carry yourself among rough men so they'd respect you without seeing you as prey. Keep your spine straight and your voice level, Margaret told her one afternoon as they hung laundry. Don't smile too much, don't apologize unless you mean it. Men out here respect strength. Show them weakness, and they'll either try to help you, which puts you in their debt, or they'll try to use you. Neither one ends well. What about kindness? Josephine asked, pinning up a sheet. Kindness is fine, just don't confuse it with softness. Margaret handed her another wet pillowcase. You can be kind and still have teeth. That's the trick. Josephine thought about that while she worked. Back in Boston, she'd been taught to be soft, agreeable, pleasant, to smooth over conflict and defer to men in all things. It had made her easy to control. Out here, that same softness would get her killed. She first saw Benjamin Baylor on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. She'd gone into town to collect supplies for Margaret, a list clutched in her hand and a small purse of coins tied to her waist. The general store was crowded with miners stocking up before heading back to their claims, and she had to wait her turn. That's when she noticed him. He stood near the back of the store, examining a coil of rope with the kind of focus most men reserved for gold. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more practical than fashionable. His clothes were worn but clean: canvas pants, a faded work shirt, a leather vest that had seen better years. But it was his face that caught her. Not because it was handsome, though it was in a rough, unfinished way, but because it looked like it had been carved by experience into something hard and unreachable. He had a scar running from his left eyebrow to his temple, the kind that came from violence, not accident. He glanced up and caught her staring. His eyes were gray, like winter sky. They held hers for a beat, then moved away without interest. Josephine felt her face heat. She turned back to the counter where Carson was weighing out flour. "That'll be $2.15, Carson said, marking it down on Margaret's account. She paid and gathered her parcels, acutely aware of the man still examining rope at the back of the store. She told herself she wasn't curious, told herself it didn't matter who he was. She was lying. "Who's that?" she asked Margaret later, trying to sound casual as they put away the supplies. "Who's who?" "The man in the store. Tall, dark hair, scar on his face." Margaret glanced at her. "Benjamin Baylor. Runs a ranch about 10 miles south of here, keeps to himself mostly." "Is he married?" "Widowed." Margaret's tone suggested the subject was closed. "Don't get ideas, Josie. That man's been through enough without you adding to it." But Josephine couldn't stop thinking about him, about those gray eyes that had looked at her and seen nothing worth noting, about the controlled way he'd moved, like every gesture was measured and deliberate. She saw him again 2 weeks later at the blacksmith shop. She'd been sent to pick up a repaired pot, and he was there having his horse reshod. They didn't speak. He nodded in her direction, basic courtesy, nothing more, and went back to discussing something with Tom in a voice too low for her to hear. The third time she saw him was at the general store again. This time, she was the one examining goods, trying to decide between 2 different types of thread, when she felt someone behind her. "The linen one holds better." She turned. He stood a respectful distance back, his expression neutral. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded and moved past her to speak with Carson. She stood there holding the thread, her heart doing something stupid and irregular in her chest. She didn't see him again for another month. By then, summer had settled over Silver Creek in full force, and she'd almost convinced herself that her fascination with Benjamin Baylor was just a symptom of loneliness and adjustment. Almost. Well, in July, one of Margaret's boarders died. His name had been Samuel, a prospector in his 60s who'd come to Silver Creek chasing rumors of a big strike. He'd never found it. Instead, he'd found a cough that got steadily worse until one morning he didn't come down for breakfast. Margaret sent Josephine to check on him. She found him in his bed, his face peaceful, his chest still. She'd never seen a dead body before. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, not sure what to feel. "He's gone," she told Margaret when she came back downstairs. Her aunt just nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll send for the doctor to make it official. You'll need to help me prepare the body." Josephine's stomach lurched. "I don't think I can." "You can." Margaret's voice was firm but not unkind. "Death is part of life out here, Josie. You'll see more of it before you're done. Better learn now." So she learned how to wash a body with respect, how to dress it in clean clothes, how to sit with death without flinching. It should have been horrifying. Instead, it felt strangely intimate, a final act of care for someone who'd died alone and far from home. They buried Samuel in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town. The whole process took less than 2 days. Out here, sentiment was a luxury. You mourned quickly and moved on, because life kept demanding things regardless of your grief. But that night, lying in her small room with the window open to the mountain air, Josephine thought about Samuel, about how he'd come west chasing something he never found, about how he died in a rented room with nothing to show for his years but a trunk of worn clothes and a few dollars in ore that hadn't panned out. Was that going to be her? 20 or 30 years from now, would she be the one dying alone in a boarding house, her grand escape from Boston amounting to nothing but hard work and an unmarked grave? She didn't sleep well that night. August brought a heat that turned the town into a furnace. The air shimmered over the main street. The creek that gave the town its name shrank to a trickle. Tempers ran short among the miners, and Margaret's boarding house felt like an oven no matter how many windows they opened. Josephine had been in Silver Creek for almost 5 months. Her hands were calloused now, her arms strong from lifting and hauling. Her skin had darkened from the sun despite Margaret's warnings to wear a hat. The dresses she'd brought from Boston hung in her closet, too impractical for the work she did, too much a reminder of a life that felt like someone else's memory. She'd written to her mother once, a short letter saying she was safe and asking if there was any chance of reconciliation. The reply had come in her father's handwriting. "You made your choice. Live with it." She'd burned the letter and hadn't written again. One afternoon, Margaret sent her to deliver a message to a ranch outside town, someone named Morrison, who sometimes bought eggs from them. Josephine took the wagon, grateful for the excuse to get out of the stifling house. The ranch was modest, a collection of buildings clustered around a main house. But on the way back, she got turned around on the dirt roads that all looked the same. By the time she realized her mistake, the sun was starting to sink and she was thoroughly lost. She pulled the wagon to a stop and looked around, trying to orient herself. Mountains to the west. That was right. But which road led back to town? "You lost?" The voice made her jump. She turned to find a rider approaching, a man on a dark horse, his face shadowed by his hat. As he drew closer, she recognized him. Benjamin Baylor. "I might be," she admitted, hating how helpless she sounded. He rode closer, his horse stepping carefully on the rocky ground. Up close, she could see the dust on his clothes, the wear in his saddle, the rifle strapped to his back like it was just another tool. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked. "Silver Creek, the boarding house." He nodded slowly, like he was calculating something. "You're about 3 miles off course. This road will take you south into rougher country. You want the fork back about a mile. Take the left branch." "Thank you." She expected him to ride on. Instead, he stayed where he was, his eyes moving from her to the wagon to the road behind her. "I'll follow you back to the fork," he said. "Make sure you find it." "That's not necessary." "No, it's not." His tone was flat, factual. "But the sun's going down and you don't know the area. If your wagon throws a wheel or your horse spooks, you'll be out here in the dark. So I'll follow you." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really an offer. It was just a statement of what was going to happen. Josephine gathered the reins. "All right. Thank you." They rode in silence, his horse trailing her wagon at a distance that felt both respectful and watchful. When they reached the fork, he pointed to the left branch without speaking. She turned the wagon, then looked back. "I appreciate this," she said. You're Margaret Hayes' niece." He said it like he was reading from a ledger. "Josephine. From Boston." The fact that he knew her name shouldn't have surprised her. Small towns had no secrets. But it did something strange to her chest to hear him say it. "Yes," she said. "And you're Benjamin Baylor." "That's right." They looked at each other for a moment. She tried to read something in his expression, interest, curiosity, anything, but his face was as closed as a locked door. "Well," he said finally, "you'll find your way from here." He turned his horse and rode back the way they'd come without another word. Josephine sat there watching him go, the dust from his horse's hooves catching the late sun like gold. Then she turned the wagon toward town and tried to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking. She didn't tell Margaret about getting lost, didn't mention Benjamin Baylor riding with her to the fork. It felt private somehow, like talking about it would make it less than it was. Not that it was anything. A man helping a stranger on the road. That was just common decency out here. It didn't mean anything. She told herself that for 3 days. On the 4th day, Benjamin Baylor came to town. Josephine was out front of the boarding house, shaking out rugs in the afternoon heat, when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see him riding down the main street, his horse moving at an easy walk. He didn't look at her, just rode past like she was part of the scenery. But an hour later, when she was in the general store buying coffee, he was there too. They didn't speak. He was examining ammunition while she waited for Carson to measure out the coffee beans. But she was aware of him the way you're aware of a storm building on the horizon, a pressure in the air, a charge that made her skin prickle. "Your aunt still making those pies?" Carson asked as he weighed the coffee. "Every Wednesday," Josephine said, dragging her attention back. "Tell her to save me one. Cherry if she's got it." "I will." She paid and turned to leave. As she passed the shelf where Benjamin stood, she saw him glance her way. Their eyes met for half a second. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Mr. Baylor." That was all. She walked out into the heat of the day, feeling like something had shifted, though she couldn't say what. That night, lying in bed, she thought about him again, about the controlled way he moved, about the scar on his face and the rifle on his back, and the way he'd followed her wagon without being asked because it was the right thing to do. Margaret had said he was widowed, had said he'd been through enough. Josephine wondered what enough meant, wondered what had carved that hardness into his face and that distance into his eyes. She wondered if anyone had ever gotten close enough to find out, and she wondered, just for a moment, in the dark privacy of her room, what it would take to be the one who did. Then she pushed the thought away and told herself to focus on survival, not foolish curiosities about hard-eyed ranchers who barely spoke. But the thought didn't quite leave. It lingered at the edges of her mind like smoke, thin and persistent, impossible to fully dispel. Outside her window, the mountains stood black against the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, on a ranch 10 miles south, Benjamin Baylor was probably asleep, unbothered by thoughts of her. She envied him that, and she hated that she envied it. September came with cooler nights and the first hints of gold in the aspen trees. Josephine had stopped counting the days since she'd left Boston. Time moved differently out here, measured not in calendar pages but in the rhythm of work, the changing light on the mountains, the slow accumulation of calluses and competence. She'd become part of Silver Creek in ways she hadn't expected. The miners at the boarding house nodded to her now, some even making clumsy attempts at conversation over breakfast. Carson at the general store saved her the freshest eggs. The schoolteacher, a thin woman named Ruth, had invited her to a quilting circle that met on Sunday afternoons. Josephine had gone once, mostly to be polite. She'd sat in Ruth's cramped parlor with 4 other women, their hands moving over fabric while they talked about whose husband was drinking too much, which mine was playing out, who'd gotten a letter from back east. "You settling in all right?" Ruth had asked, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "I think so." "It's hard at first," said another woman, Clara, who ran the laundry service with her 2 daughters. "The loneliness, I mean. Even in a town this size, you can feel awfully alone." Josephine had nodded, not trusting herself to speak, because Clara was right. She could be surrounded by people and still feel like she was standing on the far side of a river, watching life happen to someone else. She went back to the quilting circle the next week anyway. And the week after that. The women weren't friends exactly, but they were company. They asked nothing of her except her presence and her stitches. It was enough. But the loneliness Clara had mentioned didn't go away. It just changed shape. Became something she carried quietly, like a stone in her pocket, heavy enough to notice, not heavy enough to put down. Margaret noticed. She didn't say anything directly, but Josephine caught her watching sometimes with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been recognition. "You thinking about going back?" Margaret asked one evening as they washed dishes. Josephine looked up, startled. To Boston? To your old life. Whatever version of it you could salvage. No. The answer came quick and certain. Never. Margaret studied her face. You sure? Because there's no shame in admitting the frontier's not for you. Plenty of people come out here and realize they made a mistake. It's not a mistake. Josephine dried a plate, setting it carefully on the shelf. It's hard, and some days I'm so tired I can barely think, but I'd rather be tired here than comfortable in a cage. Even if the cage came with security? Safety? Safety isn't the same as being safe from yourself. Josephine met her aunt's eyes. In Boston, I was drowning in velvet and good manners. At least out here, if I drown, it'll be in something real. Margaret's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. You've got more spine than I gave you credit for. I learned from watching you. This time Margaret did smile, brief and genuine. Then I suppose I taught you something worth knowing. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and violet. Josephine dried her hands and went to the window, watching the light fade. She thought about Benjamin Baylor. She'd seen him 3 more times in town over the past month, always at a distance, always in passing. They'd exchanged nods, a few words about the weather or supplies, nothing that lasted more than 30 seconds. But she noticed things. The way he moved through town with purpose, never lingering. The way other men treated him with a respect that bordered on caution. The way he never smiled, as if he'd forgotten how or decided it wasn't worth the effort. You're thinking about him again, Margaret said from behind her. Josephine turned. Who? Don't play stupid. You're terrible at it. Margaret hung up the dishcloth. Benjamin Baylor. You get this look on your face whenever he's around. I don't. Yes, you do. Like you're trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't want to be solved. Margaret leaned against the counter. I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen. That man is broken in ways you can't fix. His wife died 3 years ago in childbirth. Baby died too. He hasn't been the same since. Josephine's chest constricted. I didn't know. Most people don't. He doesn't talk about it. Margaret's voice softened slightly. He was different before, still quiet, but not... She paused, searching for words. Not hollow. That's what grief did to him. Hollowed him out and left just enough to keep working. That's awful. It is, but it's also not your problem to solve. Margaret pushed off the counter. I know you've got a kind heart, Josie, but kindness won't heal what's wrong with him. He has to do that himself if he ever does. And trying to help someone who doesn't want help will only break you both. Josephine wanted to argue, wanted to say she wasn't trying to help, wasn't even thinking about him that way. But the words stuck in her throat because they would have been lies. I understand, she said instead. Margaret squeezed her shoulder as she passed. Good. Now finish up here. We've got an early start tomorrow. But that night, Josephine lay in bed thinking about a man she barely knew, grieving a loss she couldn't fathom. She thought about what it would take to hollow someone out like that, what it would feel like to lose everything you'd built your life around in a single terrible moment. She thought about her own losses, her family, her home, the future she'd been promised. But those losses felt small compared to his. She'd chosen to leave. He'd had everything taken from him. The difference mattered. And it made her curiosity feel intrusive, almost cruel. Who was she to wonder about his pain? What right did she have to want to know him better when he'd made it clear he wanted to be left alone? She fell asleep with those questions unanswered and dreamed of empty houses and roads that led nowhere. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Josephine was in the kitchen starting breakfast when Margaret came downstairs, her face tight with worry. There's smoke coming from the Anderson place, she said, moving to the window. Looks bad. Josephine joined her. Sure enough, a column of black smoke rose from the direction of the Anderson ranch, maybe 2 miles east of town. Even from this distance, she could see it was substantial. Should we get dressed? We're going to help. By the time they reached the ranch in the wagon, half the town was already there. The barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof and pouring from the windows. The house stood intact but threatened, only 30 feet from the burning structure. Men formed a bucket line from the well to the house, throwing water on the walls to keep the sparks from catching. Others worked to move livestock away from the danger. The air was thick with smoke and ash, the heat intense even at a distance. Josephine saw Mrs. Anderson standing near the house, her two young children clinging to her skirts, her face streaked with tears and soot. "Take the children," Margaret said, already moving toward the bucket line. "Keep them away from the fire." Josephine gathered the kids, a girl maybe 6 and a boy no older than 4, and led them to a safe distance. They were crying, scared by the chaos and their mother's distress. "It's going to be all right," Josephine told them, though she had no idea if that was true. "Is Papa going to die?" the girl asked, her voice small and shaking. "No, sweetheart, your Papa's right there." She pointed to Mr. Anderson, who was helping with the bucket line. "See, he's safe." She sat with them on the ground, letting them press against her sides, while the town fought to save what could be saved. The barn was a loss. Everyone knew it. But if they could keep the fire from spreading to the house or the other buildings, the Andersons would survive this. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of constant work, of buckets passed hand to hand, of men coughing in the smoke and pushing past exhaustion to keep going. By the time the fire finally burned itself out, the barn was nothing but a smoking skeleton of charred timber and ash. But the house stood. The other buildings stood. The livestock were safe. Josephine watched the men stagger away from the ruins, their faces black with soot, their clothes soaked with water and sweat. That's when she saw him. Benjamin Baylor stood at the edge of the bucket line, his shirt clinging to him, his face smudged with ash. He was breathing hard, his hands braced on his knees as he caught his breath. She didn't think, just grabbed a dipper of water from the bucket near her and walked over. "Here," she said, holding it out. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before it smoothed back to neutrality. He took the dipper and drank, the motion efficient and functional. "Thank you," he said, handing it back. "You helped save their house." "Everyone helped." He straightened, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "That's how it works out here." "Still, it was a good thing you did." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes. Then he nodded once and walked away to where his horse was tied. Josephine stood there holding the empty dipper, feeling like she'd missed something important in that brief exchange. Like there'd been words underneath the words, but she didn't speak the language to understand them. "You all right?" She turned to find Margaret beside her, soot-stained and tired. "I'm fine. Are the Andersons? They'll make it. Whole town's going to help them rebuild." Margaret glanced in the direction Benjamin had gone. "You talked to him?" "Just gave him water." "And?" "And nothing. He said thank you and left." Margaret made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "That's about what I'd expect." They helped Mrs. Anderson and the children gather what they'd need for the night. The family would stay at the boarding house until they could get the smoke smell out of their house. On the ride back to town, with the Anderson children drowsing in the wagon bed, Margaret was quiet. "Fire's a tear out here," she said finally. "Everything's so dry, especially this time of year. One spark in the wrong place and you can lose everything in minutes." "Has it happened before?" "Too many times." Margaret's hands tightened on the reins. "Lost a family 2 years back. Fire started in their cabin while they were sleeping. By the time anyone saw the smoke, it was too late." Josephine looked back at the column of smoke still visible in the distance. "We were lucky today." "We were, but luck doesn't last forever." Margaret's voice was grim. "That's why you build with stone when you can, keep water barrels full, and never get too comfortable." The words settled over Josephine like a warning. Nothing here was permanent. Nothing here was safe. You could work yourself to exhaustion building something, and it could all vanish in an afternoon. It should have been discouraging. Instead, it felt clarifying. Like the frontier had stripped away all the comforting lies civilization told itself and left only truth. You were fragile. The world was hard. You survived by working together, or you didn't survive at all. The Andersons stayed at the boarding house for a week. During that time, the whole town mobilized to help them rebuild. Men donated lumber and labor. Women brought food and clothing. Within 10 days, they had a new barn framed and partially roofed. Josephine helped where she could, cooking extra meals, watching the children, organizing donated supplies. She also watched the way the community came together. No questions asked, no debts tallied. You helped because someone needed help. Next time, it might be you who needed it. Benjamin Baylor was there most days, working on the barn raising with the other men. Josephine saw him from a distance, his movements economical and sure as he fitted boards and drove nails. He never came to the boarding house for meals like the others. Always brought his own food and ate alone, sitting on the back of his wagon with his shoulders hunched against the world. He doesn't like crowds, Margaret explained when Josephine asked. Too many people, too much noise. It gets inside his head. The war? Margaret nodded. That and everything after. Josephine wanted to know more, but she didn't ask. It felt like prying, like reaching into someone's wound just to see how deep it went. But she noticed things anyway. The way he'd flinch at sudden loud noises. The way he'd position himself so his back was never to an open space. The way his hand would drift to where a gun would hang, even when he wasn't armed. These weren't the habits of a man at peace. These were the reflexes of someone who'd survived things that left marks deeper than scars. On the last day of the barn raising, Josephine was helping serve water to the workers when Benjamin approached. Not directly. He was heading to his wagon, but close enough that she could speak without raising her voice. Mr. Baylor? He stopped, turned slightly. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you've done for the Andersons. No thanks needed, just doing what's right. Still, it matters. He studied her face, his expression unreadable. You settling in all right to Silver Creek? The question surprised her. I am. It's different than I expected, but... She paused, searching for honesty. I think I needed different. Something shifted in his eyes, not warmth exactly, but a slight thaw in the permafrost. Different has a way of showing you who you really are. Not everyone likes what they find. What did you find? The question came out before she could stop it. Too personal, too direct. She watched him consider whether to answer, watch the walls go back up. Someone who could survive, he said finally. That's about it. He touched his hat brim in a gesture of dismissal and walked to his wagon. Josephine watched him go, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. That night she thought about his answer, someone who could survive, not someone who could thrive or be happy or find meaning. Just survive. It was the saddest thing she'd ever heard. October brought the first real cold. Frost covered the ground in the mornings, and the mountains wore caps of fresh snow. The miners who worked claims at higher elevations started coming down for the winter, swelling the town's population and filling every available room at the boarding house. Margaret hired a girl named Lucy to help with the increased workload. She was 17, tough as boot leather, with a mouth that could make a mule skinner blush. Josephine liked her immediately. Where are you from? Lucy asked on her first day, scrubbing pots with aggressive enthusiasm. Boston, Lucy snorted. City girl, what the hell are you doing out here? Long story. They always are. Lucy attacked a particularly stubborn stain. I'm from St. Louis. Came out with my pa when I was 12. He died in a cave-in 2 years ago. Been working my way since. The casual way she said it, like death was just another fact to state, reminded Josephine how different life was out here. Grief wasn't something you wallowed in. It was something you acknowledged and then kept moving past, because stopping meant dying. I'm sorry, Josephine said. Don't be. He taught me everything I needed to know before he went. Lucy rinsed the pot and set it aside. You know how to shoot? What? A gun. You know how to shoot one? No. You should learn. Woman alone out here needs to be able to defend herself. Lucy dried her hands. I could teach you, if you want. Josephine thought about it. The idea of holding a gun, of deliberately learning how to kill something, felt foreign and slightly repulsive. But Lucy was right. This wasn't Boston. The rules were different. All right, she said. Teach me. They went out on Sunday afternoon, walking a mile from town to a rocky area where the sound wouldn't carry. Lucy brought an old revolver and a box of ammunition she'd borrowed from Tom the blacksmith. First thing you need to know, Lucy said, loading the gun with practiced ease, is that this isn't about being fancy or quick. It's about being accurate and not hesitating when it matters. She showed Josephine how to hold the weapon, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. The first shot kicked harder than Josephine expected, the sound sharp enough to make her ears ring. Not bad, Lucy said, squinting at the tree they were using as a target. You hit the trunk. Try again. They spent 2 hours practicing. By the end, Josephine's hands were sore, and her ears wouldn't stop ringing, but she could hit the tree with reasonable consistency. You're better than I thought you'd be, Lucy admitted as they walked back. Most city girls can't handle the noise. I'm not most city girls anymore. Lucy grinned. Damn right you're not. The lessons became a regular thing. Every Sunday, weather permitting, they'd go out and practice. Josephine found she liked it. Not the violence the skill implied, but the focus it required. The way everything else fell away when she sighted down the barrel. The satisfaction of hitting what she aimed at. Margaret noticed the change. You're getting harder, she observed one evening. Is that bad? No, just different. Margaret poured coffee, the steam rising in the cold kitchen. The Josephine who showed up in June wouldn't have lasted a month. The one standing here now might just make it. What changed? You stopped waiting for someone to save you. Margaret handed her the coffee cup. Started saving yourself instead. It was true. Somewhere between the endless labor and the shooting lessons and the quiet accumulation of frontier competence, Josephine had stopped looking over her shoulder at her old life. Had stopped imagining scenarios where her father would apologize, or her mother would intervene, or some convenient solution would appear. She was here. This was her life now. And she was going to survive it on her own terms. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. Winter was coming, and winter in the mountains was no joke. Margaret took inventory of their supplies. We'll need more firewood, she said, checking off items on her list, and another barrel of flour, coffee, lamp oil. We get snowed in, we might not see town for weeks. Should I go to the general store? Take the wagon. Get everything on this list. Margaret handed her a piece of paper covered in her tight script. And don't let Carson talk you into any substitutions. I want exactly what I wrote. Josephine took the wagon to town, the list tucked in her pocket. The general store was crowded with other people doing the same thing, stocking up before the deep snows came. She waited her turn, watching Carson weigh and measure with the efficiency of long practice. Need all this delivered? Carson asked when she handed him the list. I've got the wagon. It's a lot of weight. I can have my boy bring it out tomorrow. I can manage. Carson raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He started pulling items from the shelves while Josephine wandered the store. That's when she saw Benjamin Baylor near the back, examining a new stove that Carson had recently acquired. She should have left him alone, should have minded her own business like Margaret had told her to. She walked over anyway. Are you thinking of buying it? She asked, nodding at the stove. He glanced at her, then back at the stove. Considering it, mine's on its last legs. That one looks sturdy. It is. Also costs more than I want to spend right now. He ran a hand over the iron surface. But I'll need something before winter really sets in. They stood there in awkward silence. Josephine searched for something to say that wouldn't sound stupid or intrusive. How's your ranch? She asked finally. Surviving. That seems to be the standard out here. He almost smiled. Almost. Pretty much. Mr. Baylor. Benjamin. The correction was quiet but firm. Just Benjamin. Benjamin? She tried again, the name feeling strange in her mouth. I wanted to... if you ever needed... She stopped, frustrated with herself. I'm making a mess of this. What are you trying to say? She met his eyes. I know what people say. About you wanting to be left alone, and I respect that. But if you ever needed help with something, or just, I don't know, company, you wouldn't have to ask. He stared at her for a long moment. She watched something move behind his expression, surprise, maybe, or confusion, like he couldn't quite figure out why she was offering. That's kind of you, he said slowly, but I do fine on my own. I know you do. I'm just saying you don't have to. Everyone has to eventually. His voice was flat, factual. Relying on other people just means disappointing them or watching them leave. Better to keep your own company. The words landed like stones. Josephine felt the dismissal in them, the wall going back up. All right, she said quietly. I understand. She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. Josephine. She looked back. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. I appreciate the offer, he said. I'm not good at this anymore. At what? At being around people. A conversation that isn't about work or weather. He looked away, his jaw tight. The war took some things. Everything after took the rest. What's left isn't worth much company. I don't believe that. You should. But there was less conviction in his voice than his words suggested. Carson called from the front that her order was ready. Josephine looked at Benjamin one more time, wanting to say something that would matter, that would make a difference. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think you're as broken as you believe you are. She left before he could respond, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The wagon was loaded heavy, just like Carson had warned. Josephine drove it carefully back to the boarding house, her hands numb on the reins despite her gloves. But her mind wasn't on the cold or the supplies or the road ahead. It was on a man standing in a general store, surrounded by tools and goods, and the quiet loneliness of someone who'd forgotten how to let anyone in. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Josephine woke to frost on the inside of her window and the sound of wind howling around the corners of the house. Winter had arrived in earnest. She pulled on extra layers and went downstairs to help Margaret start breakfast. The kitchen was cold despite the stove, and their breath misted in the air. It's going to be a hard one, Margaret said, feeding wood into the fire. I can feel it. How hard? The kind where we might lose someone before spring. Margaret's face was grim in the lamplight. Every winter, someone doesn't make it, gets caught in a storm, runs out of food, freezes in their cabin because their fire went out. You just hope it's not someone you know. Josephine thought about Benjamin alone on his ranch 10 miles from town, about what would happen if something went wrong, and there was no one there to help. Stop it, Margaret said, reading her face. He's been through worse winters than this. He'll be fine. I wasn't. Yes, you were. Margaret pointed a wooden spoon at her. And I'm telling you to stop. That man's survival isn't your responsibility. I know that. Do you? Because you've got that look again. The one that says you're going to do something foolish out of kindness. I just offered to help if he needed it. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. And what did he say? That he does fine on his own. Then believe him and leave it alone. Margaret turned back to the stove. The frontier's hard enough without taking on other people's burdens, especially people who don't want to be saved. Josephine knew her aunt was right. Knew that she was projecting something onto Benjamin that probably wasn't there. Some romantic notion that underneath his hardness was someone worth reaching, but she couldn't quite let it go. Couldn't quite stop wondering what it would take to prove him wrong about himself. The boarders came down for breakfast, stamping snow off their boots and complaining about the cold. Josephine served eggs and bacon and coffee, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and driving snow against the glass. Winter had come to Silver Creek, and it brought with it all the isolation and danger the frontier could offer. Josephine poured coffee and listened to the wind and tried not to think about a man alone on a ranch with a dying stove and no one to help if something went wrong. She failed completely. December buried Silver Creek under 2 feet of snow in a single night. Josephine woke to a world transformed, white and silent and so cold that the nails in the walls had frost creeping around them like fingers. The boarders huddled near the stove, their breath visible even inside, complaining about frozen water buckets and the price of lamp oil. Margaret moved through the chaos with the steady calm of someone who'd survived too many winters to panic over one more. Lucy, get more wood from the shed. Josie, start melting snow for water. The pump's frozen solid. And someone check on Mrs. Chen at the laundry. She's older and lives alone. Josephine pulled on every layer she owned and went outside. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. She'd thought Boston winters were harsh. This was something else entirely. A cold that wanted to kill you, that found every gap in your clothing and worked its way inside. She filled buckets with clean snow and hauled them to the kitchen, her fingers going numb despite her gloves. It took 6 trips before they had enough water melting on the stove. By then her face felt like frozen leather, and her lungs burned from breathing air that sharp. This normal? She asked Margaret, peeling off her wet gloves. For here? This is just the start. Margaret poured coffee, the steam rising thick. We'll get storms worse than this before spring. Sometimes they last days. You hunker down and wait them out, or you die trying to be clever. The words should have frightened her. Instead, they felt like just another set of rules to learn. Don't go out in a blizzard, keep your firewood dry. Check on your neighbors, survive until the thaw. Simple. Brutal. Clear. Tom the blacksmith came by mid-morning, his beard thick with ice, to check that everyone at the boarding house was all right. Carson's got his store open if anyone needs supplies, he said, stamping snow off his boots. But the price on everything just went up, supply and demand. Bastard, Margaret muttered, but without real heat. That's just business out here. Anyone heard from the outlying ranches? Tom asked, accepting the coffee Lucy handed him. Not yet. Roads are probably impassable. Margaret frowned. Morrison should be fine. He stocks up heavy. But some of the smaller operations might have trouble. Josephine thought immediately of Benjamin. His ranch was 10 miles out with a stove that was failing. She opened her mouth to ask about him, then caught Margaret's warning look and shut it again. Tom noticed anyway. Baylor's place? He'll be fine. That man could survive in a cave with nothing but a knife and bad memories. He drained his coffee. I should check on the Johnsons, though. They've got that new baby and their cabin's not built for this kind of cold. He left, and the day settled into the rhythm of winter survival. Keep the fires burning, melt enough snow for water, cook meals that would stick to ribs, keep people from going stir-crazy in close quarters. By evening, Josephine was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of constant vigilance, of knowing that one mistake, a fire left untended, a door left open, could kill everyone in the house. She fell asleep that night to the sound of wind howling like something alive and hungry, rattling the shutters and searching for a way inside. 3 days later, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it hurt to look at, and the sun came out blazing on snow that reflected the light back like shattered glass. Everything was white and blinding and achingly beautiful. It was also deadly quiet. Too quiet, Margaret said, standing at the window. Someone should ride out and check the ranches. Make sure everyone made it through. I'll go, said one of the boarders, a miner named Jack who had a horse stabled at the livery. Take someone with you, Margaret ordered, and be back before dark. Another storm's coming. I can smell it. Jack left with another miner, and the house settled into waiting. Josephine tried to keep busy, but her mind kept drifting to those outlying ranches, to people alone in cabins with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. Jack and his companion returned just before sunset, their faces grim. Lost too, Jack said, pulling off his gloves with stiff fingers. Old man Peterson froze in his cabin. Fire must have gone out during the night, and the Cooper's place burned down. Looked like they tried to keep too big a fire going, and it got away from them. The Coopers? Margaret's face went pale. All of them? They made it out. Staying with the Harrisons now. But they lost everything. The news settled over the room like ash. Peterson had been a fixture in Silver Creek for years, a solitary prospector who'd never struck it rich, but had never given up trying. The Coopers were a young couple with 3 small children, barely scraping by even before the fire. We'll take up a collection, Margaret said quietly, and organize a supply run once the road's clear. What about Baylor's place? The question came out before Josephine could stop it. Jack looked at her. Didn't make it that far. His ranch is another 5 miles past Morrison's, and the drifts were too deep. We'll check on him next run. The words sat in Josephine's stomach like stones. 5 more days before anyone would ride out that way. 5 days when anything could happen. She tried to tell herself Margaret was right. Benjamin had survived worse. He'd be fine. It wasn't her concern. But the trying didn't make the worry go away. That night, she dreamed of a cabin buried in snow, its chimney dark and cold, and a man inside who'd stopped believing anyone would come looking. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Margaret made a decent meal and they sang a few songs, but the holiday felt hollow in the face of winter's relentlessness. The second storm Margaret had predicted arrived on Boxing Day and lasted 4 days straight. The snow piled so high against the boarding house that they had to dig out the door just to get to the woodshed. Lucy twisted her ankle on the ice and spent 2 days hobbling around, cursing everything from the weather to the territory itself. One of the boarders came down with a fever that had everyone worried it might be something contagious, but it broke after 3 days and turned out to be nothing more than a bad cold. And through it all, Josephine kept thinking about Benjamin, kept imagining scenarios where something had gone wrong. A fall from a horse, an injury with no one to tend it, a fire that went out and couldn't be restarted. "You're going to drive yourself mad," Lucy said one afternoon as they folded laundry. "Either he's fine or he's not. Worrying won't change it." "I know," Do you? Because you have been walking around like a ghost for days. Lucy snapped a sheet straight. What is it about him anyway? He's not even that good looking. Kind of scowly, if you ask me. Josephine couldn't explain it, couldn't put into words what drew her to a man who'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her or anyone else. Maybe it was because he reminded her of herself, someone who'd been broken by circumstances and was trying to survive the aftermath. Or maybe it was just loneliness, recognizing loneliness across a crowded room. I don't know, she said honestly. I can't stop thinking about him out there alone. Men like that are alone because they want to be, Lucy said, not unkindly. You can't save someone who doesn't want saving. I'm not trying to save him. Lucy gave her a look that said she didn't believe that for a second. Sure you're not. The third week of January brought a brief thaw. The temperature climbed above freezing for 3 days straight, melting enough snow to make the roads passable. Margaret immediately organized a supply run to the Cooper family and to check on the outlying ranches. I'm going, Josephine said. Margaret looked up from the list she was making. The hell you are. You need someone to help drive the wagon. Lucy's ankle is still healing. I can do it. It's dangerous, Josie. The roads are bad and another storm could blow in without warning. Then we'd better hurry. Josephine met her aunt's eyes. I'm going. You can argue or you can give me the list. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then sighed and handed over the paper. You're as stubborn as your father, just smarter about when to dig in your heels. They loaded the wagon with supplies, food, blankets, lamp oil, firewood, and clothes donated by the townspeople. Tom the blacksmith volunteered to drive, and one of the miners named Pete came along for extra muscle. The journey was harder than Josephine had expected. The roads were rivers of mud and slush, the wagon lurching through ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel. Twice they had to stop and dig themselves out. Once they had to unload half the supplies to get across a swollen creek. But they made it to the Harrisons' place by noon. The Cooper family was living in a single room off the main house. 7 people crammed into a space meant for 2. Mrs. Cooper cried when she saw the supplies, her children pressing against her skirts with hollow eyes. We didn't know if anyone would come, she whispered. We didn't know if anyone even knew. Everyone knows, Tom said gruffly, unloading blankets, and everyone's going to help. We'll get you back on your feet come spring. They stayed long enough to unload most of the supplies and hear the story of the fire. Mr. Cooper had been trying to heat the cabin during the worst of the storm and had stuffed too much wood in the stove. A log had rolled out when he opened the door to add more, landing on a pile of kindling they'd kept too close. The fire had spread faster than he could stop it. We barely got the children out, Mrs. Cooper said, her voice shaking. Another minute and… She couldn't finish. Josephine squeezed her hand. But you did. You're all safe. That's what matters. From there, they visited Morrison's ranch and 2 other smaller operations, making sure everyone had survived and had enough supplies to last until the next thaw. Everyone was alive, though most were running low on food and sick of being trapped indoors. One more stop, Tom said as they climbed back onto the wagon. Baylor's place. Josephine's heart kicked against her ribs. She kept her face neutral, her hands steady on her lap, but inside she was wound tight with anticipation and dread. The road to Benjamin's ranch was the worst yet. Drifts had piled across the track in places, and they had to break trail with the horses, moving at a crawl. The sun was already sinking toward the mountains when they finally saw buildings in the distance. The ranch was smaller than Josephine had imagined. A modest house, a barn, a few outbuildings, all weathered and functional rather than pretty. Smoke rose from the chimney, a good sign. Tom pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and hollered, "Baylor, you alive in there?" The door opened and Benjamin stepped out, rifle in hand, his face wary. When he saw who it was, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Tom wasn't expecting anyone. Road just cleared, came to check everyone made it through the storms. Tom climbed down from the wagon. You all right? Fine. Benjamin's eyes moved to Josephine, then away. Storm was rough, but I managed. You need anything? We've got supplies. I'm good. Tom looked unconvinced. When's the last time you had fresh food? Benjamin didn't answer, which was answer enough. Tom started pulling things from the wagon, a sack of potatoes, some dried apples, coffee, bacon. I don't need charity, Benjamin said, his voice tight. It's not charity. It's neighbors looking after neighbors. Tom set the supplies on the porch. Besides, half this stuff was donated by people in town. You refusing would insult them. It was a blatant manipulation, and everyone knew it, but Benjamin just picked up the sack of potatoes without arguing further. Appreciate it, he said quietly. Pete was checking his horses, giving them water from a bucket. Tom went to help, leaving Josephine and Benjamin alone in the yard. The silence stretched. Josephine searched for something to say that wouldn't sound ridiculous. Your chimney's smoking, she finally offered. That's good. We heard about Peterson. Yeah. Benjamin's jaw tightened. He was a stubborn old fool. Wouldn't accept help from anyone. Sounds familiar. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Benjamin looked at her, really looked, for the first time since they'd arrived. You came all the way out here to insult me? I came all the way out here to make sure you were alive. Why? The question was blunt, almost hostile. Josephine met his eyes and refused to look away. Because someone should care whether you make it through the winter. That someone doesn't have to be you. Maybe not. But it is. She crossed her arms against the cold. You can be angry about it, or you can accept it. Either way, it's true. Benjamin stared at her like she was speaking a language he'd forgotten how to understand. Then he looked away, his hand coming up to rub the back of his neck, a gesture of discomfort or confusion. I don't know what you want from me, he said finally. I don't want anything. I'm just... She struggled to find the right words. I'm just telling you that you're not as alone as you think you are. I am, though. His voice was flat. Everyone I've ever cared about is gone. That's just a fact. It doesn't have to stay that way. Yes, it does. He turned back to face her, his expression hard. Because I'm not going through that again. I'm not building something just to watch it burn, so whatever you think this is... He gestured between them. It's not. It can't be. The rejection stung worse than Josephine had expected. She felt it like a slap, sharp and immediate. But underneath the hurt was something else. Recognition. Because she understood what he was saying. Understood the instinct to protect yourself by refusing to let anyone close. All right, she said quietly. I understand. Do you? Better than you think. She turned toward the wagon. Take care of yourself, Benjamin. She climbed onto the wagon seat before he could respond. Tom and Pete were already mounted up, ready to go. As they pulled away, Josephine didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her until they crested the first hill and the ranch disappeared from view. The ride back to town was quiet. Tom tried to make conversation a few times, but gave up when Josephine's responses stayed monosyllabic. By the time they reached Silver Creek, the sun had set and the temperature was dropping fast. Margaret was waiting on the porch, her face tight with worry that eased when she saw them. Everyone make it? She asked. Everyone's alive, Tom confirmed. Some better off than others, but they'll make it to spring. Josephine helped unload what was left of the supplies, her movements mechanical. She could feel Margaret watching her, but didn't meet her aunt's eyes. If Margaret asked what was wrong, Josephine was afraid she might actually break. Later, alone in her room with the window frosted over and the wind starting to pick up again, she let herself feel the full weight of Benjamin's rejection. She'd offered him friendship, maybe more, and he'd thrown it back in her face. Not cruelly, but firmly, definitively. She should leave it alone. Should take the hint and stop thinking about him, stop wondering, stop caring. She knew she wouldn't, because stubborn ran in her family, apparently. And once Josephine Stewart decided something was worth fighting for, she didn't give up easily, even when the thing she was fighting for didn't want to be saved. February arrived with another massive storm that trapped them indoors for a week. The boarding house started to smell like too many people in too small a space. Tempers flared over nothing, someone's boots left in the wrong place, a comment about the food, the way someone chewed. Josephine broke up 2 fistfights and seriously considered starting a third herself, just to have something to do. Cabin fever, Margaret diagnosed, happens every year. People go a little crazy when they're trapped together too long. How much longer until spring? 2 months? Maybe 3. Margaret stirred the stew she was making, the smell of onions and meat filling the kitchen. And that's if we're lucky. Josephine wanted to scream, wanted to walk out into the snow and just keep walking until she found somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't 4 walls and the same dozen faces, and the constant press of other people's needs. Instead, she went to her room, closed the door, and did target practice with an unloaded pistol Lucy had lent her. She drew and aimed at imaginary threats until her hands were steady and her breathing was calm. It helped. A little. The storm finally broke in mid-February, and the town emerged like survivors from a shipwreck. Everyone was pale and exhausted and desperate for fresh air and space. Josephine went for a walk through town just to remember what it felt like to move without bumping into someone. That's when she saw the smoke. Not cooking smoke or chimney smoke. Black smoke, thick and ugly, rising from the direction of the boarding house. She ran. By the time she got there, the fire had already consumed the kitchen. Flames poured from the windows, eating through the dry wood like it was paper. The boarders were outside in their nightclothes despite the cold, and Margaret stood among them, her face gray with shock. "What happened?" Josephine gasped. "Stovepipe failed." Margaret's voice was numb. "It must have been burning through the wall for hours. By the time we smelled smoke, it was too late." Men from town were already forming bucket lines, but everyone could see it was hopeless. The building was too dry, the fire too established. All they could do was try to keep it from spreading to neighboring structures. Josephine watched the boarding house burn, watched her room and her few possessions go up in flames, and felt something break loose inside her chest. It wasn't grief exactly, it was something colder. The recognition that nothing was permanent, nothing was safe, and you could do everything right and still lose everything to chance and timing. "At least everyone got out," someone said. "Yeah," Margaret said, "at least there's that." But her voice was hollow. The boarding house had been her life, her independence, her escape from Boston, and everything that had tried to crush her. And now it was ash. They stood there until the fire burned itself out, until the building was nothing but a skeleton of charred timber and smoke. The cold started to seep in, and people began to disperse, offering places to stay and promises of help. Tom approached Margaret, his face soot-stained. "You and your niece can stay with me and the wife. We've got room." Margaret looked lost, a thing Josephine had never seen before. "I don't—" "It's settled then." Tom's voice was firm. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." They gathered what they could from the wreckage. Not much, just a few items that had been outside or in the shed. Everything else was gone. Clothes, books, money, the small inheritance from Josephine's grandmother that she'd hidden under her mattress. All of it. Gone. At Tom's house, his wife Sarah fussed over them with blankets and hot coffee. Margaret sat by the fire, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around a cup she didn't drink from. Josephine excused herself and went outside. The night was clear and cold, the stars sharp overhead. She could still smell smoke on her clothes, in her hair, on her skin. She'd come to Colorado with nothing, had built a life from scratch through labor and determination, and now she was back to nothing again. The frontier was teaching her a lesson, and the lesson was brutal. Everything you build can be destroyed. Everyone you love can leave. The only thing you can count on is your ability to survive and start over. She thought about Benjamin, about his insistence on staying alone and unattached. Maybe he'd figured out the lesson before she had. Maybe grief had taught him early what she was learning now, that caring about anything just gives the world more ways to hurt you. But even thinking that felt like surrender. And Josephine had spent too many months fighting to survive to give up now. She went back inside. Margaret was still sitting by the fire, but her eyes had cleared somewhat. "What are we going to do?" Josephine asked quietly. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she straightened her spine. "We survive," she said. "Same as always. We figure out what comes next and we do it." "How?" "I don't know yet." Margaret finally took a sip of her coffee. "But we will, because that's what we do." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something to hold on to in the dark. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Boston. Josephine recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it, Sarah and Margaret watching from across Tom's kitchen table. The letter was brief and to the point. Her father had heard through some business connection about the fire. He was willing to offer her passage back to Boston and a position in his household as a companion to her mother. No mention of the marriage to Harold Grimstead, no apology for what had passed between them, just an offer to come home, conditional on her complete obedience and gratitude. "He's trying to rescue you," Margaret said quietly, "but only if you'll be properly grateful for it." Josephine read the letter twice. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she might have been tempted. The frontier was hard. She'd lost everything. Going back to Boston, to security and warmth and a life without constant struggle should have sounded like salvation. Instead, it sounded like prison. "What will you do?" Sarah asked. Josephine folded the letter carefully. Then she walked to the stove and fed it to the fire. They watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. "I'm staying," she said. Margaret's face showed something that might have been pride. Even with nothing? Even starting over from scratch? Especially then. Josephine met her aunt's eyes. "Because if I go back now, it proves him right. It proves that I couldn't make it, that I needed him after all. And I'll be damned if I give him that satisfaction." "Language," Sarah murmured, but she was smiling. "So we rebuild," Margaret said. "But we'll need capital. I've got some money saved, but not enough to replace the boarding house." "What about a loan from the bank?" Josephine suggested. "The bank won't lend to a woman without a man to co-sign." Margaret's voice was bitter. "That's just how it works." They sat in frustrated silence, each turning the problem over in their minds. Josephine thought about the silver mines, about the men who came to Silver Creek with dreams of striking it rich. Most failed, but the ones who succeeded did it by taking risks. "What if we don't rebuild the boarding house?" she said slowly. Margaret looked at her. "What do you mean? What if we do something different? Something smaller that doesn't need as much capital?" An idea was forming, still rough but gaining shape. A restaurant maybe, or a bakery. Something that serves the town but doesn't require maintaining a whole building full of rooms. Margaret considered it. A restaurant could work. Miners need feeding, and most of them can't cook worth a damn. We could do simple food, hearty portions, reasonable prices. And I could help, Sarah offered. I'm a decent cook, and Tom could build tables and benches. The idea took hold, growing from possibility to plan as they talked through details. They'd need a location, supplies, some way to attract customers. But it was doable. Hard, but doable. "It's risky," Margaret warned. "We could put everything we have into this and still fail." "We could," Josephine agreed. "But at least we'd fail trying. That's better than going back to what we were running from." Margaret smiled, sharp and fierce. "You really are my niece." That night, Josephine lay on the spare bed in Tom and Sarah's house and thought about the choice she'd made. She'd chosen uncertainty over security, struggle over comfort, the possibility of failure over the guarantee of a gilded cage. And she didn't regret it, not even a little. The building they found was little more than a shed with delusions of grandeur. It sat on the edge of Silver Creek's main street, wedged between the assayer's office and a vacant lot where someone had started building something years ago and given up. The roof leaked in 3 places. The floor was warped. One wall had a hole the size of a man's fist that let in wind and snow. "It's perfect," Margaret said, walking the perimeter with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to see potential in wreckage. "It's a disaster," Josephine countered, but she was already mentally cataloging what needed fixing and what could wait. The owner was a man named Dutch, who'd won the property in a card game and had been trying to unload it ever since. He wanted $50. Margaret offered $20. They settled on $35, with Dutch throwing in some lumber he had stacked behind his place. "You ladies are crazy," he said, shaking Margaret's hand to seal the deal. "But I admire the attempt." They spent 2 weeks making the place habitable. Tom built tables and benches from Dutch's lumber while Josephine and Margaret scrubbed years of accumulated dirt and mouse droppings. Lucy showed up on the 3rd day with a hammer and a box of nails she'd stolen from somewhere. "I'm bored," she announced. "Put me to work." Sarah organized a donation drive through the quilting circle. Women appeared with mismatched plates and cups, dented pots and pans, cutlery that had seen better days. It wasn't pretty, but it would function. Carson at the general store extended them credit for supplies: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, bacon. "Payment when you can," he said gruffly. "And I expect a discount on meals." "Fair enough," Margaret agreed. The work was relentless. Josephine's hands, which had finally toughened from months of boarding house labor, developed new blisters from hammering and sawing. Her back ached from scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. At night, she collapsed into bed at Tom's house, too exhausted to dream. But there was something satisfying about building instead of just surviving. about creating something from nothing through sheer determination and borrowed materials. They opened on a Tuesday in early March. No grand announcement, no fanfare. Margaret just propped the door open at noon and started cooking. The smell of bacon and fresh bread drifted down the street. The first customer was a miner named Roberts who looked skeptical of the whole operation. "What are you serving?" "Bacon, beans, bread, and coffee," Margaret said. 25 cents for a full plate. "That include refills on the coffee?" "It does." Roberts sat down. "All right then. Let's see what you've got." He cleaned his plate and asked for seconds. By the time he left, 3 more miners had wandered in, drawn by the smell and Robert's enthusiastic eating. Word spread. By evening, they'd served 23 meals and made just over $5. "Not bad for a first day," Margaret said, counting the coins. "We'll need to do better to make rent and pay Carson back," Josephine pointed out. "We will. People need time to realize we're here." Margaret pocketed the money. "But it's a start." The restaurant, they never bothered naming it, people just called it Margaret's Place, became part of Silver Creek's routine. Miners came in for breakfast before heading to their claims. Shopkeepers stopped by for lunch. Evening brought whoever was too tired or too incompetent to cook for themselves. The work was harder than the boarding house had been. They opened at dawn and didn't close until after dark. Josephine cooked, served, cleaned tables, washed dishes, and started over again the next day. Her hands were perpetually raw from hot water and lye soap. The smell of bacon grease permeated her clothes and hair, but they were making it. Slowly, painfully, they were building something that might actually survive. One afternoon in late March, Benjamin Baylor walked in. Josephine was wiping down tables, her hair tied back in a kerchief, her apron stained with evidence of the lunch rush. She looked up and froze. He stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure he should be there, his hat in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. "We're open," Margaret called from the kitchen before Josephine could find her voice. Benjamin sat at a table near the window, setting his hat on the bench beside him. Josephine approached with the coffee pot, her heart doing something irregular behind her ribs. "Coffee?" she managed. "Please." She poured, careful to keep her hand steady. "We've got beef stew or ham with beans today." "Stew's fine." She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where Margaret was stirring a pot that smelled like heaven. "That's Baylor," Margaret observed. "I know. You going to be all right serving him, or should I do it?" "I can manage." Josephine ladled stew into a bowl, added a thick slice of bread, and carried it out. Benjamin was staring out the window at the muddy street, his posture rigid. She set the bowl in front of him. "Thank you," he said without looking at her. She should have walked away, should have left him to eat in peace like she would any other customer, but words pushed up her throat before she could stop them. "I didn't expect to see you in town." "Needed supplies." He picked up his spoon. "Heard you were running this place now." "Margaret and me together, yes." "After the fire." It wasn't a question. "After the fire," she confirmed. "We lost everything, so we started over." He finally looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something move behind his eyes. "That must have been hard." "It was, but it also made things clear." She wiped her hands on her apron. "When you've got nothing to lose. Makes it easier to take risks. Or easier to fail. Maybe. But at least you tried." She met his gaze. "That counts for something." He studied her face for a long moment, then went back to his stew without responding. Josephine returned to the kitchen, her hand shaking slightly. "What did he say?" Margaret asked. "Nothing much." "You all right?" "I don't know." Josephine picked up a dishcloth just to have something to do. "I thought I was over it. Over him, I mean. But seeing him sitting there..." She shook her head. "I'm being foolish." "You're being human." Margaret tested the beans, added more salt. "But you need to decide something, Josie. Either you're going to keep hoping he'll change his mind, or you're going to let it go and move on. Because the in-between is going to eat you alive." "I know. But knowing and doing were different things." Benjamin finished his meal and left coins on the table. Exact payment, no tip. He nodded to Josephine on his way out, replaced his hat, and walked back into the cold March afternoon. She watched him go through the window, something heavy settling in her chest. April brought mud season. The snow melted into thick, clinging muck that sucked at boots and made the streets nearly impassable. Business at the restaurant slowed as people stayed home rather than slogged through the mess. But Margaret had anticipated this and started offering food for takeaway. Meals wrapped in cloth that miners could carry to their claims. It kept them afloat, barely. Money was tight. They'd paid back most of what they owed Carson, but rent was coming due and they were short. Josephine did the math 3 times, trying to find a way to make the numbers work, but they always came up the same. "We're $15 short," she told Margaret. "I know. I've been counting too." Margaret sat at one of the tables after closing, her face lined with exhaustion. "We could ask Tom for a loan. We're already living in his house. I don't want to ask him for money too. Then we need to bring in more business." Margaret rubbed her eyes. "Maybe we could stay open later. Catch the evening crowd from the saloon." "The saloon crowd doesn't want food. They want whiskey." "Some of them want both." Margaret stood, her joints cracking. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But her voice lacked conviction. That night, Josephine lay awake staring at the ceiling of Tom and Sarah's spare room, turning the problem over in her mind. They were working themselves to exhaustion and still barely scraping by. One bad week, one unexpected expense, and they'd lose everything again. She thought about her father's letter, now ash in Sarah's stove, thought about the easy solution it had offered. All she had to do was surrender. The thought made her feel sick. 2 days later, Benjamin came back. It was early afternoon, the quiet time between lunch and dinner. Josephine was in the kitchen making bread when she heard the door open. She wiped flour from her hands and went out. He stood near the same table he'd sat at before, but this time he didn't sit down. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "All right." She glanced toward the kitchen where Margaret was washing dishes. "Here, or outside might be better." They stepped out into the muddy street. The afternoon sun was weak but warming, the air smelling of thaw and possibility. Benjamin seemed uncomfortable, his weight shifting from foot to foot. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what you said, about starting over after the fire." Josephine waited, not trusting herself to speak. "And about what I said, before, at my ranch." He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. I didn't handle that well. You were honest. I was cruel." His jaw tightened. "You offered kindness and I threw it back at you. That wasn't right. You were protecting yourself, I understand that." "Do you?" He turned to face her fully. "Because I'm not sure I do anymore. I spent 3 years convinced that staying alone was the only way to avoid getting hurt again. That if I didn't let anyone close, I couldn't lose anyone else." "That's not wrong. It's not right either." He took a breath, like the next words cost him something. "I heard about what happened with your father. About the letter." Josephine stiffened. "How did you? Small town. People talk." He held up a hand. "I'm not judging. I wanted to say that what you did took guts. Turning down an easy way out to stick with something hard and uncertain. I didn't really have a choice." "You did. You just chose the harder path because it was the right one." He paused. "That means something." They stood there in the muddy street, the silence stretching between them. Josephine wanted to ask what he was really saying, what this conversation was actually about. But she was afraid to push, afraid to break whatever fragile thing was happening. "I'm not good at this," Benjamin said quietly. "At talking, at being around people. The war broke something in me, and then losing Anna and the baby finished the job. What's left?" He stopped, struggling. "What's left doesn't work right anymore. You seem like you work fine to me. I can survive. That's different from living." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something vulnerable in his gray eyes. "You make me think maybe I could try to do both. I don't know if I'm capable of it anymore, but you make me want to try." Josephine's throat tightened. "Benjamin, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not proposing or making promises I can't keep. I'm just saying that I was wrong to push you away. And if you're willing to tolerate my company occasionally, I'd like that." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even really a declaration of interest. But it was more than he'd given anyone in 3 years, and Josephine understood what it cost him to offer even this much. "I'd like that too," she said softly. He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "All right then. All right." He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I should let you get back to work." "Wait," she caught his sleeve. Would you want to have dinner here sometime? Not as a customer, as..." She searched for the right word. "As company?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I could do that." "Sunday? We close early on Sundays." "Sunday works." He left, and Josephine stood in the street watching him go, something warm and terrifying blooming in her chest. Margaret was waiting when she went back inside, arms crossed and eyebrows raised. So? So what? Don't play dumb. What did he want? Josephine couldn't help the smile that crept across her face. To apologize. And I think he wants to be friends. Friends? Margaret's tone suggested she didn't believe that for a second. It's a start. It's something, all right. Margaret shook her head, but she was smiling too. Just be careful, Josie. That man's been hurt bad. If you're going to let him close, be sure you're ready for what that means. I know what it means. I hope so. Sunday came with perfect spring weather, clear skies and warm sun that felt like a promise after the brutal winter. Josephine spent the afternoon cooking while trying to pretend she wasn't nervous. She made roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, biscuits that came out actually fluffy for once, and a dried apple pie that was Margaret's specialty. It's just dinner, Margaret said, watching her fuss. You're not cooking for royalty. I know, I just want it to be good. It will be. Now stop hovering and set the table before you drive me crazy. Benjamin arrived exactly when he said he would, washed and shaved, wearing clothes that looked like he'd actually pressed them. He carried a bottle of whiskey that he handed to Margaret. For your trouble, he said. No trouble, but I'll take it anyway. Margaret pocketed the bottle. Sit. Food's ready. They ate at one of the tables, the restaurant empty except for the three of them. The conversation was stilted at first, full of awkward pauses and safe topics. The weather, the state of the roads, news from town. But gradually, as the meal progressed, things eased. Benjamin asked how the restaurant was doing. Josephine found herself telling him about their money troubles, about being short on rent. How short? He asked. $15. She immediately regretted saying it. But we'll figure it out. We always do. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I could lend it to you. No. The refusal came quick and firm. Thank you, but no. Why not? You said you needed it. Because borrowing money from friends is how you lose friends. She met his eyes. And I'd rather keep you as a friend than take your money. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. Fair enough. Margaret cleared the plates and brought out the pie. Benjamin ate 2 pieces and complimented the crust so sincerely that Margaret actually blushed. After dinner, he helped wash dishes over both women's protests. I'm not useless in a kitchen, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Anna taught me the basics before... He stopped, the grief catching him mid-sentence. Margaret squeezed his shoulder as she passed. She sounds like she was smart. She was. He scrubbed a plate with focused attention. She would have liked you both. She didn't have patience for people who couldn't handle hard work. It was the most he'd ever said about his wife. Josephine wanted to ask more but didn't, sensing that pushing would break whatever spell had allowed him to speak freely. When the dishes were done, Benjamin lingered near the door, his hat in his hands. Thank you, he said. For dinner. And for... He gestured vaguely. Everything. You're welcome any time, Josephine said, and meant it. He nodded, settled his hat, and stepped out into the evening. She watched him walk to where his horse was tied, watched him ride away into the gathering dark. That went well? Margaret observed from behind her. It did. He's coming around. Slowly, but he's coming around. Maybe. Josephine closed the door against the cooling air. Or maybe he's just lonely enough to take what scraps of company he can get. Does it matter which? I don't know. Josephine turned to face her aunt. Should it? Margaret considered the question. Not if you're patient. But if you're expecting him to wake up one day and be healed, you're going to be disappointed. Men like that, broken men, they don't heal clean. They heal crooked, and you have to decide if you can live with the scars. What if I can? Then you'll probably be fine. Margaret started banking the fire in the stove. Just don't lose yourself trying to fix him. That's a trap women fall into, and it never ends well. The words stayed with Josephine as she lay in bed that night. She wasn't trying to fix Benjamin, but she was trying to show him that not everything had to stay broken. That sometimes, if you were brave enough, you could build something new from the pieces. Whether he'd believe that was another question entirely. The next week brought the solution to their rent problem from an unexpected source. A freight company opened an office in Silver Creek and started hiring local restaurants to provide meals for their drivers. Margaret landed the contract, 20 meals a day at 30 cents each. That's $6 a day, Josephine calculated, scribbling numbers on scrap paper. Times 6 days a week, $36 a week. Margaret grinned, sharp and triumphant. We're going to make it. They celebrated by staying open an extra hour and drinking the whiskey Benjamin had brought. Lucy joined them, and Sarah, and even Ruth, the schoolteacher. They sat around one of the tables in the empty restaurant, passing the bottle and talking about nothing important. To surviving, Margaret said, raising the bottle. To surviving, they echoed. Josephine drank and felt the whiskey burn down her throat, warming her from the inside. 6 months ago, she'd been a Boston debutante who'd never worked a day in her life. Now she was a restaurant owner with calloused hands and a future built on borrowed money and determination. The transformation should have felt strange. Instead, it felt right. Benjamin started coming to dinner every Sunday. It became routine. He'd arrive at 6, they'd eat, they'd talk, he'd help with dishes and leave by 8. The conversations got easier. He told stories about the ranch, about dealing with stubborn cattle and predators and weather that tried to kill everything. Josephine told him about difficult customers and kitchen disasters, and Margaret's increasingly creative profanity. They didn't talk about the past much. Didn't discuss Boston or the war or the people they'd lost. Those subjects were too raw, too likely to draw blood. Instead, they talked about the present and the small, manageable future, what to plant in the garden, whether the road to his ranch would be passable next week, if the silver mines would keep producing or play out. Safe topics. Comfortable topics. But underneath the safe conversation, something else was building. Josephine felt it in the way Benjamin's eyes would linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way his hand would brush hers when they both reached for the same dish, in the charged silence that would fall sometimes, heavy with things neither of them was ready to say. Margaret noticed. You two are dancing around each other like teenagers. We're being careful. You're being cowards. But Margaret said it without heat, though I suppose careful and cowardly look the same from the outside. May arrived with wildflowers and warm winds. The restaurant was thriving, not rich, but stable. They'd paid back Carson completely, made rent with money to spare, and even started saving for a rainy day. The freight company contract kept them busy, and word had spread enough that they had regular customers beyond the miners. Josephine had settled into the rhythm of it. Wake early, cook, serve, clean, sleep, repeat. Her body had adapted to the work. Her hands were permanently stained and scarred, her arms strong from lifting heavy pots. She'd stopped looking in mirrors much because the woman who looked back was a stranger. Or maybe she was finally becoming herself. One Sunday in mid-May, Benjamin arrived earlier than usual. The sun was still high, the afternoon warm enough that Josephine had propped the restaurant door open to let in air. You're early, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. I know, I need to. He stopped, looking uncomfortable. Can we talk? Privately? Her stomach dropped. Of course. They walked to the edge of town, past the last buildings to where the land opened up into grassland and distant mountains. Benjamin was quiet, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders tense. What's wrong? Josephine finally asked. Nothing's wrong. I just need to. He stopped walking and turned to face her. I'm not good at this. At any of this. But I need to say something and I don't know how to make it sound right. Just say it. He took a breath. I'm lonely. Have been for 3 years. I thought I wanted to be alone. Thought it was safer. And maybe it is safer, but it's also. He struggled for words. It's killing me, slowly, and I can't keep living like that. Josephine waited, her heart pounding. These past few weeks, coming to dinner, talking to you. It's the first time since Anna died that I've felt like maybe I could be human again. Not happy, maybe, but human. He met her eyes. And I don't want to go back to how things were. What are you saying? I'm saying I need... He stopped, frustrated. I need a partner. Someone practical who understands that life out here is hard and uncertain. Someone who won't expect things I can't give. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was honest in a way that cut straight through. You're asking me to marry you, Josephine said quietly. I'm asking if you'd consider it. As a practical arrangement, you'd have security, a home, protection. I'd have... He paused. I'd have someone. That's more than I've had in years. What about love? I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. His voice was flat. I loved Anna. When she died, it felt like she took that part of me with her. What's left isn't much, but it's yours if you want it. It was possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of marriage, but Josephine looked at his face, at the vulnerability and pain he was trying so hard to hide, and understood what he was really asking. He was asking if she was brave enough to build something from broken pieces, if she could accept him as he was, scars and all, without demanding he become someone he wasn't. I need to think about it, she said. Relief crossed his face. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Can I ask you something first? Anything. Why me? Why not someone else? He considered the question seriously. Because you understand what it's like to lose everything and start over. Because you're strong enough to survive out here without needing me to save you, and because... He stopped, something raw moving across his expression. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel quite so alone. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her, and it was enough. I'll think about it, she said again, and I'll give you an answer soon. He nodded, and they walked back to town in silence. But it was a different silence than before, charged with possibility and the weight of choices that would change everything. That night, Josephine sat with Margaret in the empty restaurant after closing, the lamp burning low between them. She told her aunt everything, the walk, the proposal, Benjamin's brutal honesty about what he could and couldn't offer. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face unreadable in the dim light. When Josephine finished, silence stretched between them. What do you think? Josephine finally asked. What do I think? Margaret leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight. I think you're asking the wrong question. What should I be asking? Not what I think, what you want. Margaret's eyes were sharp. Because this isn't about me or Benjamin or anyone else. This is about whether you can live with what he's offering. It's not exactly a fairy tale. Fairy tales are lies we tell children to keep them docile. Margaret's voice was hard. Real life is messier. You take what you can get and you make it work, or you don't, but you do it with your eyes open. Josephine traced a pattern on the table with her finger. He said he doesn't know if he can love me. At least he's honest about it. Most men lie, then resent you when you expect what they promised. Margaret poured herself more coffee from the pot on the stove. Question is, can you live with that? With a man who might never give you what you want emotionally? I don't know. Then you need to figure it out. Because saying yes to this, it's not just marriage. It's choosing a hard life on a remote ranch with a damaged man. You'll be isolated, working yourself to death, probably for years before things get easier. Margaret met her eyes. You need to be sure that's what you want. What did you want? When you left Boston? Margaret smiled, bitter and knowing. Freedom. I wanted to make my own choices, even if they were bad ones. I got what I wanted, and it cost me everything I had, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat, even knowing what it would cost. Especially knowing what it would cost. Margaret set down her cup, because the alternative was dying slowly in a pretty prison, and I'm too mean to go out that way. Josephine thought about that, about choosing the hard path because the easy one would kill something essential inside you, about survival versus living. I need to see the ranch, she said suddenly. Before I decide, I need to know what I'd be saying yes to. Margaret nodded. Smart. Go tomorrow. I can manage here for a day. The next morning, Josephine borrowed Tom's horse and rode out to Benjamin's ranch. The road was better now that spring had dried the mud, but it still took over an hour of steady riding. She'd sent word ahead through one of the freight drivers, so Benjamin was expecting her. He was in the yard working on a fence when she arrived, his shirt off in the warm May sun. She'd never seen him without at least 2 layers before. His back was a map of scars, some from war, she guessed, others from the brutal work of ranching. He pulled his shirt back on when he saw her, his movements quick and self-conscious. "You came," he said, stating the obvious. "I needed to see it. The ranch. Before I decide." He nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll show you around." The ranch was bigger than she'd expected, but more run down. The barn needed repairs. The house was solid, but spare. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above. Everything functional, nothing decorative. The work of a man living alone with no reason to make things pretty. "It's not much," Benjamin said, watching her take it in. "But it's mine. Outright. No debt." "How many acres?" 300, most of it grazing land for cattle. He pointed toward the hills. "I've got about 50 head right now. Could support twice that if I had help managing them." They walked the property, Benjamin explaining the operation in practical terms. Water sources, grazing rotation, the eternal battle against predators and weather. He didn't romanticize it. Didn't try to sell her on the life. Just laid out the facts like he was describing a business transaction, which, Josephine supposed, was exactly what this was. "The house needs work," he admitted as they returned to the yard. "Roof leaks in 2 places. Floor needs replacing in the kitchen. And it gets cold in winter, really cold. I've been meaning to add insulation but haven't had time." "What would my days look like if I said yes?" He considered the question seriously. "Depends on the season. Spring and summer are calving and branding, then haying. You'd help with that, plus managing the house, the garden, preserving food for winter. Fall is roundup and selling cattle. Winter is just survival, keeping livestock fed, staying warm, not going crazy from isolation." "It sounds hard." "It is hard, harder than running a restaurant." He met her eyes. "I won't lie to you about that. This life breaks people. I've seen it happen." "But you're still here." "I don't have anywhere else to go." His voice was flat. "And I'm too stubborn to quit." They stood in the yard while the sun climbed higher and the day warmed around them. Josephine looked at the ranch, at the worn buildings and the endless work and the isolation, and tried to imagine herself here, tried to picture years of hard labor and long winters and a husband who might never love her. It should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like a challenge. "Can I see inside the house?" she asked. He led her in. The interior matched the exterior, functional but cheerless. A table and 2 chairs, a cook stove that looked ancient, a bed in the corner that had clearly been slept in by only one person for too long. Everything was clean but impersonal, like a hotel room occupied by someone passing through. "Anna's things are in a trunk upstairs," Benjamin said quietly. I couldn't get rid of them, but I could move them if that would be easier." "No." Josephine surprised herself with the firmness of her response. "Don't. She was your wife. She belongs here." Something shifted in his expression. Most women wouldn't want reminders. "I'm not most women." She turned to face him. "And I'm not trying to replace her. I couldn't even if I wanted to. I know." He leaned against the door frame, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "That's one reason I asked you. You understand that some things can't be fixed or forgotten. You just learn to live with them." "Is that what you've been doing? Living with it?" "Barely." The admission seemed to cost him something. "Some days, I'm not sure why I keep going. Then I remember I'm too mean to give up, same as your aunt." Josephine almost smiled at that. She'd appreciate the comparison. They stood in the sparse room, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable but weighted with understanding. 2 broken people considering whether their broken pieces might fit together well enough to build something functional, if not beautiful. "I need more time," Josephine said finally. "Not much, but I need to be sure." "Take whatever you need." He walked her back outside to where her horse was waiting. "And Josephine, whatever you decide, I'll respect it. No hard feelings either way." She nodded and mounted up. As she rode away, she looked back once to see him standing in the yard, alone against the vast emptiness of sky and grass and mountains. The image stayed with her all the way back to town. Margaret was waiting when she returned, questions in her eyes, but wisdom enough not to ask them. Josephine helped with the dinner service, her mind elsewhere, weighing and measuring and trying to calculate a future that couldn't be calculated. That night, she dreamed of Boston, of her father's house and the life she'd left behind. In the dream, she was sitting in the parlor wearing a silk dress, married to Harold Grimstead, slowly suffocating under the weight of propriety and expectations. She woke gasping, her heart pounding, the moonlight streaming through the window. The dream gave her the answer she'd been searching for. She found Benjamin 3 days later at the general store, buying supplies. He saw her and went still, his whole body tensing like he was bracing for impact. "Can we talk?" she asked. Here's fine." Carson made himself busy at the other end of the store, giving them the illusion of privacy. Josephine took a breath and committed to the leap. "My answer is yes." Benjamin stared at her for a long moment, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She was surprised to find it was true. "It's not perfect, and you're not perfect, and I'm definitely not perfect. But it's real, and I'd rather have something real and hard than something easy and false." "It's going to be hard," he warned, like he needed her to understand fully. "Really hard. And I can't promise you that I'll ever be what you might want me to be. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are." She met his eyes. "Just don't lie to me. Don't pretend to feel things you don't. I can handle honesty. I can't handle being played for a fool." "I won't lie." He said it like a vow. "That's one thing I can promise you." "Then that's enough." They made arrangements quickly and without fuss. No church wedding. Ruth, the schoolteacher, had the authority to perform civil ceremonies, and did it in her parlor with Margaret and Tom as witnesses. Josephine wore a simple dress Lucy had helped her make from sturdy cotton. Benjamin wore the same clothes he'd worn to their first dinner, pressed and clean. The ceremony took 5 minutes. Ruth spoke the words, they made their responses, and it was done. Legally bound, for better or worse. "Well," Margaret said afterward, pulling Josephine into a fierce hug, "you're officially crazy, but you're my kind of crazy. I learned from the best. Don't forget it." Margaret released her and turned to Benjamin. "You hurt her. I'll kill you. Slowly." "Understood," he said without a trace of humor. "Good. Now get out of here. You've got a ranch to run." They rode out that afternoon, Josephine's few belongings packed on a spare horse. The journey to the ranch felt different this time. Not like visiting, but like going home. The word felt strange even thinking it, but she tried it on, seeing if it fit. Home. Benjamin's ranch. Her ranch now, too. The idea was still settling when they arrived. Benjamin helped her unload her things, his movements careful and formal, like he wasn't sure how to act around her now that the vows were said. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," he said, not meeting her eyes. Until you're ready for—" "No," Josephine cut him off. "We're married. We'll figure it out. I don't want to rush you." "You're not." She set her bag down and faced him. "This is a partnership, right? We agreed on that. Partners share the work and the space, including the bed." He looked uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. Since Anna, "We don't have to do anything tonight, but I'm not making you sleep in the barn on our wedding night. That's ridiculous." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You're bossy. You're just figuring that out now?" She started unpacking, giving him something to do besides stand there looking uncomfortable. "Come on, help me put these away and then you can show me where you keep the cooking supplies. I'm making dinner." They fell into an awkward routine. Josephine cooked while Benjamin tended to evening chores. They ate at the small table, the conversation stilted but civil. After dinner, she washed dishes while he did paperwork, recording the day's work in a ledger worn soft with use. Night fell. Benjamin built up the fire while Josephine changed into her nightgown behind a curtain she'd strung across one corner. When she emerged, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, his boots off but still fully dressed. "I can sleep on the floor," he offered. "The bed's big enough for 2. She climbed in, staying on her side, leaving space between them. "We're adults. We can manage this." He extinguished the lamp and lay down, stiff as a board, careful not to touch her. They lay there in the dark, the silence stretching awkward and thick. "This is weird," Josephine finally said. "Yeah." She heard the relief in his voice that she'd said it first. "It is. It'll get easier." "Will it?" It has to. She turned on her side to face where she knew he was in the darkness. We'll make it easier. That's what people do. I hope you're right. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted from the day and the weight of the choice she'd made. When she woke in the pre-dawn gray, Benjamin was already gone, up and working, keeping to the rhythm of ranch life that stopped for nothing, not even a wedding night. The first weeks were harder than Josephine had anticipated. The work was relentless and unfamiliar. She'd learned to cook in a restaurant kitchen, not over a temperamental wood stove with limited ingredients. She'd learned to clean boarding house rooms, not manage a household that required preserving food and managing livestock and 1,000 other skills she didn't have. Benjamin taught her what he could, his patience surprising her. He showed her how to milk the cow without getting kicked, how to collect eggs from chickens that resented the intrusion, how to tell when the garden needed water just by looking at the soil. You're learning fast, he said one evening, watching her efficiently handle a task that had taken her an hour the first time she'd tried it. I'm motivated. She wiped sweat from her forehead. Failure out here means starving or freezing. That's good motivation. It is. He paused, then added, You're doing well. Better than I expected. What did you expect? Honestly, I expected you to last maybe a month before asking to go back to town. He said it without judgment, just stating a fact. This life, it's not for everyone. I'm not everyone. She straightened, her back aching from bending over the garden. And I didn't come this far just to quit when things got hard. Something in his expression softened. No, I suppose you didn't. The nights remained awkward. They shared the bed but stayed on opposite sides. The space between them a gulf neither seemed ready to cross. They were polite, careful, considerate. Everything except intimate. Until the night of the storm. It came in late June, a violent thunderstorm that shook the house and sent rain hammering against the roof like bullets. Lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that rattled the windows. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Josephine woke to find Benjamin sitting up, his breathing harsh and irregular. Even in the darkness, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the blanket. Benjamin? He didn't respond. Lightning flashed again and he flinched hard, a sound escaping his throat that wasn't quite a gasp. She understood then. The war. The thunder sounding like artillery, his mind trapped in memories that wouldn't let him go. She sat up slowly, careful not to startle him. Benjamin, it's just a storm. You're home. You're safe. I know. His voice was strangled. I know that, but my body doesn't. Another crash of thunder. He flinched again, his jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. He grabbed onto it like a lifeline, his grip almost painful. They sat there in the dark, thunder rolling overhead while he fought whatever demons the storm had summoned. Talk to me, she said quietly. Tell me about something else. Anything else. He struggled for words. The ranch. When I first bought it, it was nothing. Just land and a half-collapsed cabin. Everyone said I was crazy to think I could make it work. Were they right? Almost. His breathing was starting to slow. First winter nearly killed me. I didn't know what I was doing and I was too proud to ask for help. Lost half my cattle to cold and stupidity. But you didn't give up. I didn't know how. He was still holding her hand, his grip gradually easing. And then Anna came. She'd been working at the hotel in town saving money to go to California, but she took one look at this place and said she could make it work. Was she right? She was right about most things. His voice was softer now, the edge of panic fading. She had a gift for seeing potential in broken things. Like you? Like me. He took a shaky breath. She made this place a home. Made me believe maybe I could be something other than broken. The storm was passing, the thunder growing more distant, but they stayed sitting up, hands linked in the darkness, while he talked about his wife for the first time since her death. About how she'd died screaming while he held her hand and couldn't do anything to help. About the baby that had come too early and too still. About the years since then that had felt like wandering in fog. I'm sorry, Josephine said when he finally fell silent, for what you lost, for what happened. I am too. He was quiet for a moment, but I'm starting to think maybe I can survive it.
With help. You can. She squeezed his hand. You have been surviving it, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. He turned to look at her in the darkness. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she felt the shift in the air between them, something opening, some wall coming down. Thank you, he said quietly, for being here, for not running when you saw how broken I am.
We're all broken in different ways. She didn't let go of his hand. The trick is finding someone whose broken pieces fit with yours. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Then, slowly, carefully, he pulled her closer. She went, settling against his side, his arm coming around her shoulders. They stayed like that for the rest of the night, listening to the storm fade and the morning arrive. It wasn't romance, it wasn't passion, but it was real. Two damaged people holding on to each other in the dark, finding comfort in shared brokenness. It was enough. After that night, things shifted between them. Not dramatically, but in small ways that accumulated into something significant. They started touching more, hands brushing while passing tools, shoulders bumping while working side by side, small gestures of affection that felt earned rather than obligatory. Benjamin talked more, sharing stories about the ranch and his past that he'd kept locked away. Josephine reciprocated, telling him about Boston and her father and the life she'd fled. They learned each other in increments, building trust through honesty and shared labor. The physical intimacy came gradually. A kiss that started hesitant and grew more certain. Nights where the space between them in bed disappeared. The awkward, fumbling relearning of how to be with another person. It wasn't perfect, they were both too damaged for perfect, but it was real and honest and theirs. Summer passed in a blur of work and slow, steady connection. They hayed and branded and fought a constant battle against predators and weather and equipment that broke at the worst possible times. Josephine learned to rope a calf, to set a fence post, to deliver a breech birth when one of the cows had trouble. She also learned Benjamin. Learned his silences weren't rejection, but processing. Learned his nightmares came and went in cycles tied to weather and seasons, and triggers he couldn't always identify. Learned that underneath the hardness was a man who'd been taught by violence that caring about things meant losing them, but who was slowly, painfully, learning to risk it anyway. In August, Margaret rode out to visit. She looked around the ranch, noting the repairs they'd made and the garden flourishing under Josephine's care. "You look different," she observed over coffee. "Different how?" "Settled." Margaret studied her face. "Not happy exactly, but like you found where you're supposed to be." "Maybe I have." Josephine glanced out the window where Benjamin was working in the barn. "It's not what I expected, but I think it might be what I needed." "He treating you right?" "He's treating me honestly. That's better than right." Margaret smiled, sharp and knowing. "You've learned something then." "What's that?" "That sometimes the best thing you can get is someone who won't lie to you about what they can offer." She set down her cup. "Your father sent another letter to the restaurant, forwarded from Tom's place." Josephine's chest tightened. "What did it say?" "I didn't open it. Figured it was yours to read or burn as you saw fit." Margaret pulled the envelope from her bag. "But I'd guess it's more of the same. Demands that you come back, threats about the family name, maybe some token offer to forgive you if you're sufficiently penitent." Josephine took the letter. The handwriting was her father's, precise and controlled. She walked to the stove and fed it to the fire without opening it. "Not even curious?" Margaret asked. "No." And it was true. Whatever her father had to say didn't matter anymore. That life, that version of herself, was ash. What remained was something harder, more real, and entirely her own. Margaret stayed for dinner. She and Benjamin circled each other warily at first, two damaged, suspicious people testing boundaries. But by the time the meal was done, they'd found common ground in their shared stubbornness and refusal to accept easy answers. "You take care of her," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "I will," Benjamin promised. "And let her take care of you. Pride's fine, but it's a poor substitute for partnership." He nodded, understanding more than the words said. "I'm learning that." After Margaret left, Benjamin and Josephine stood in the yard watching the sunset behind the mountains. The evening was cool, summer already beginning its slow fade toward fall. "She's terrifying," Benjamin observed. "She is, But she's also the reason I survived long enough to get here. Josephine leaned against his side, his arm coming automatically around her shoulders. Everything good in my life came from following her example. Even me? Especially you. She tilted her head to look at him. You're difficult and damaged, and you have nightmares that wake me up twice a week. But you're real. You don't lie about who you are or what you can give. That's worth more than easy. He pulled her closer. I'm trying to be better than I have been. You're doing fine. Am I? He sounded genuinely uncertain. You're here. You're trying. That's all anyone can do. She turned to face him fully. We're both broken, Benjamin, but we're broken together, and somehow that makes it bearable. He kissed her then, slow and deliberate, and for once she felt him fully present, not lost in grief or memory, but here with her, choosing this moment. I think I might love you, he said when they broke apart. The words were halting, uncertain, like he was testing unfamiliar language. I'm not sure yet, but I think maybe I could. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But it was more than he'd offered anyone in 3 years, and Josephine understood the courage it took to say it. I think I might love you too, she said softly. We'll figure it out together. Together, he repeated, like testing the word. Then more firmly, yeah, together. The seasons turned. Fall brought roundup and the sale of cattle, money that would carry them through winter. Winter came hard again, but they were prepared this time, stocked with food and firewood, ready for months of isolation and cold. The isolation that had nearly killed Benjamin the previous years felt different with Josephine there. They worked together, ate together, slept together. They talked through long evenings, played cards by lamplight, read aloud from the few books they owned. When the nightmares came, she was there to pull him back. When the weight of the work threatened to crush her, he was there to share the load. They fought sometimes. Sharp words exchanged when exhaustion frayed tempers. Disagreements about how to handle problems or spend limited money. But they learned to fight fair, to apologize when wrong, to choose the partnership over pride. Spring came again, and with it news from town. The restaurant was thriving. Margaret had hired 2 more helpers and was talking about expanding. The silver mines were still producing. Silver Creek was growing, becoming something more permanent than a collection of desperate people chasing wealth. And a letter arrived from Boston, addressed to Josephine. She recognized her mother's handwriting this time. She opened it carefully. The letter was brief. Her father had died suddenly. Heart failure, the doctor said. The funeral had been well attended. The business was being sold. Her mother was moving to live with relatives in Philadelphia. There was no request that Josephine come home. No recriminations or pleas, just the facts, stated simply, and a final line. I hope you found what you were looking for. Your father never understood, but I think perhaps I do now. Josephine read it twice, waiting to feel something. Grief, relief, vindication, any of the emotions that should accompany a parent's death. But all she felt was a distant sadness for what had never been and now never could be. She showed Benjamin the letter that evening. He read it silently, then handed it back. Are you all right? He asked. I think so. She folded the letter carefully. He was my father, but he stopped being my parent when he tried to sell me. I mourned that loss a long time ago. Do you want to go to Philadelphia to see your mother? No. The answer came without hesitation. My life is here now, with you. That's what matters. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face against his shoulder. They stood like that while the evening darkened outside and the ranch settled into its familiar nighttime sounds. I do love you, he said quietly. I'm sure now. It's not the same as what I felt for Anna, but it's real. I know. She did know. Could feel it in the way he held her, in the way he'd learned to let her in the 1,000 small gestures of care and consideration that made up their daily life. I love you too. Even though I'm difficult? Because you're difficult. She pulled back to look at him. Easy would have been boring. He smiled, a real smile, the kind she saw more often now, but that still felt like a gift. You're crazy. I learned from the best. The years passed. They lost cattle to harsh winters and predators. They gained cattle from successful breeding. They added rooms to the house, making it bigger and more comfortable. They hired help during busy seasons, drifters looking for work, young men trying to learn ranching, once even a woman fleeing an abusive husband who stayed for 2 years before moving on. Margaret visited regularly, eventually bringing with her a quiet widower she'd met in town. They married the same way Benjamin and Josephine had, quick and practical, without fuss. The two couples became something like family, supporting each other through hard times and celebrating together when things went well. Lucy married one of the miners and had 3 children in quick succession. Ruth, the schoolteacher, retired and was replaced by a young man from back east. The town kept growing, becoming more settled, more permanent. Through it all, Benjamin and Josephine worked their ranch and built their life. It was never easy. The land was too harsh, the work too demanding, the isolation too complete for easy. But they'd never wanted easy. They'd wanted real, and real was what they built. 5 years after their marriage, Josephine found herself pregnant. The news terrified them both, the ghost of Anna's death haunting them through every month of the pregnancy. But when their daughter was born healthy and screaming, something fundamental shifted. They named her Sarah, after Tom's wife who'd helped them when they had nothing. Benjamin held her with shaking hands, his face wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "I thought I'd never have this again," he said quietly. "Thought I didn't deserve it after failing Anna." "You didn't fail her, you just lost her." Josephine touched his face, drawing his eyes to hers. "And you deserve this. We both do." Sarah was followed by 2 more children over the next 6 years, a boy they named James and another girl named Margaret, who lived up to her namesake's fierce spirit from the moment she drew breath. The house grew louder, fuller, messier. The work multiplied exponentially. But so did the joy. The small, ordinary joy of watching children grow, of teaching them what they knew, of building something that would outlast them. On their 10th anniversary, Benjamin and Josephine stood on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was teaching James to rope a fence post while Margaret dug in the dirt with the intensity of a prospector searching for gold. "You ever regret it?" Benjamin asked. "Saying yes that day?" "No?" Josephine leaned against him, his arm coming automatically around her waist. "Not even on the hardest days." "Not even when I'm difficult?" "Especially not then." She turned to kiss him, quick and familiar. "I chose this. Chose you. I'd choose it again." Even knowing how hard it would be? The hard is what makes it worth having. She gestured to the ranch, the children, the life they'd built from nothing. "Easy wouldn't have taught me who I really am. Wouldn't have shown me what I'm capable of." He pulled her closer. "I love you. More than I thought I was capable of loving anything again." "I know." She did. Could feel it in every day they'd survived together, every challenge they'd faced as partners, every small gesture of care that added up to a life. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat by the fire. Josephine thought about the girl she'd been in Boston, privileged, sheltered, controlled. That girl would never have survived what she'd endured, would never have had the strength to build what she'd built. Leaving had broken her. The frontier had shattered her into pieces. But in putting those pieces back together, she'd created something stronger than what she'd been before. And Benjamin, broken, haunted Benjamin, had done the same. Together, they'd taken their damaged parts and built something functional, something real, something that mattered. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined. It was harder, stranger, more painful, and more rewarding than any fantasy could have captured. But it was theirs. "What are you thinking?" Benjamin asked, watching her stare into the fire. "That we did it. Against all odds, we actually did it." "Did what?" "Survived. Built something. Made it work." She turned to look at him. "Created a life worth living." "We did." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses and scars that marked years of hard work. "Together." "Together," she agreed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and singing through the gaps in the boards. But inside, the fire burned warm and steady. The children slept safely in their beds. And 2 people who'd learned the hard way that nothing was guaranteed held on to each other in the darkness, grateful for what they'd built and ready for whatever came next. Because that's what survival looked like. Not perfection, not ease, not the absence of pain. Just 2 broken people choosing each other, day after day, year after year, building something real from the wreckage of what they'd been before. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.